Hello and welcome to the Rubens house. We are, of course, in the former house and workshop of the painter Peter Paul Rubens. And I am the curator or the director of the Rubens House Museum, and my name is Ben van Benneden. I'm going to take you through the house, but I suppose it is best to start in the courtyard of the house. When Rubens came back from Italy in 1608, he got married with an Antwerp girl, Isabella Brandt, and after 2 years, the young couple bought a house with grounds very near to the most important street of Antwerp, the Meer. A couple of years later, he started to rebuild the house, and he also significantly enlarged the premises. And for inspiration, he looked, of course, to Italy. Behind me is the famous garden screen. It has the form of a Roman triumphal arch. But certain details also point to Italian late Renaissance architecture. For example, the central arch of the portico is inspired by no one other than Michelangelo. It is not a round arch. As you can see, the arch is geniculated, and that is a specific invention made by Michelangelo. On top of the garden screen, we see two Olympian gods. One is Mercury, and the other goddess is Minerva. And Rubens, by putting those statues of those gods on top of the garden screen, he says to the visitors, my house is dedicated to the arts and to wisdom and to knowledge. And then all that will bring you to virtue, which is personified by another god, or better, a semi-god, Hercules. Hercules in the 17th century was the absolute hero of virtue. And in a nutshell, that kind of represents the philosophy and the artistic vision of Peter Paul Rubens, who was not just a brilliant painter, but Rubens was also a learned painter or a humanist painter. And he is in a way looking to the art of the past to make the art of the future. Now, these elements are fully original. They were designed by Rubens, and after over 400 years, they are still here. The rest of the house is more or less reconstruction. Behind me, for example, we see the facade of Rubens' studio, his famous workshop. And in the 17th century, that facade would have been decorated by Rubens in trompe-l'œil painting. So illusionistic painting to look like sculpture. And today, of course, those paintings are no longer there. But what we see is fairly correct. The iconography, the meaning, the messages conveyed, that's all correct. But again, in the 17th century, it was painted. I suggest we now take a look inside. Hello again. We are now in the parlor, so in the first room of the museum, and we are now in the old house. And behind me, we see two engravings, works on paper, and they are the oldest portraits of the house. They show the house how it looked like, or must have looked like, at the time of Rubens. And in fact, those engravings formed the basis of the reconstructions of the house in the 20th century. Let's move on. The next room that we're visiting is the dining room, and there's plenty to see here. We have portraits and we have still life paintings. For example, the painter of that one is no one other than Fransa Снейдерса. And Fransa Снейдерsa was generally considered as the most important, the most talented, the most skillful still life painter of the 17th century. He was a friend of Rubens. We know that both painters worked together on several paintings. So Снейдерс then would concentrate on the flowers, vegetables, still life elements, and Rubens would concentrate on the figures. We know that Rubens was an admirer of Fransa Снейдерс' works, and he also owned a number of paintings by Fransa Снейдерс. Behind me is a portrait. It's a longer-term loan from a private collection, and it is an unfinished portrait of a young lady, a rather beautiful young lady, holding a chain. We don't know who she is, but we do know that the portrait was painted in Italy. It was painted around 1605, 1606, when Rubens was living and working in Italy. It is unfinished, as you can see when we look at the edges, and also the dress of the woman is painted very sketchily, very rapidly. It is a kind of, well, it's really a virtuoso picture in the sense that it is painted with economy of means, very quickly. And maybe, we can't be sure about that, Rubens painted it in no more than a day. Maybe it was a preparatory work, or maybe it is a work that he abandoned for some reason. Nevertheless, it is still a very strong portrait. There's another portrait in this room that requires special attention. This is the portrait of, or a portrait of Helena Furma. And Helena Furma was Rubens' second wife. 4 years after the death of his first wife, Isabella Brandt, who died from an infectious disease at a fairly young age, he married Helena. Like Isabella Brandt, Helena Furma was also from Antwerp. She was also much younger than Rubens. This portrait is a reduced copy of a larger portrait, a full-length portrait, which is now in Munich, and which was probably painted on the occasion of Helena's marriage to Rubens. It is painted by Rubens and studio, so we assume that the dress and the jewels were painted by Rubens' assistant or assistants, and that the face was touched up or retouched by the master. Now, Helena Furma plays a fairly important role in Rubens' life. When he married this woman, Rubens was already 53, but one could say that she kind of gave Rubens a second youth. Helena became his muse. You see, Helena, from the moment they got married, you see Helena appearing in all sorts of disguises in Rubens' picture. As Venus, for example, the goddess of love, or as one of the beautiful women in Allegories of Love. And in that sense, I'm pretty sure that she really had an impact on his life and art. I suggest that we now go to the art gallery room. So, an art gallery room, the name speaks for itself. It's a room where works of art are being kept and displayed. And every important citizen, and certainly wealthy citizens, would have had such a room in the house. And Rubens was, of course, no exception, except that his house would have been absolutely full with works of art. But there are some specific objects that here in this room that require our attention, and this is one of them. It's a small scale sculpture or statuette. It's Adam and Eve, and they are carved in ivory out of one elephant's tooth. Now, one of the reasons that I'm talking about this little sculpture is not just because it is beautiful. It's an exquisite object, but also because Rubens designed such objects. He had in his workshop a number of exceptional sculptors and ivory carvers who executed small ivories after Rubens's design. And few people know that. Rubens was a man of many talents, was an exceptional painter. He designed tapestries, he designed title pages, book illustrations, but also sculptures, small-scale sculptures and silverwork. So, a beautiful ivory carved by Georg Petel, a German sculptor who worked in Rubens's workshop in the 1620s. The centerpiece is, again, a still life by Adriaan van Utrecht. He was one of the star still life painters of Antwerp. This particular still life is one of the works that are really dear to my heart. It is very sober, very simple. The only thing that we see are luscious vegetables. But the thing that makes this, or the element that makes this picture work, is in fact the superb lighting of the picture. It has a certain dynamism that is very, very peculiar or very special in still life painting. It is as if there's a drama, a vegetable drama going on in this particular picture. Look at the light in this cabbage and the detail of all those intricate elements. It's, in a way, you could look at it as a tribute to nature. But of course, it's also very painted. It's excitement in paint. The art gallery is a room in the old house, so the part of the house that Rubens bought, that he didn't rebuild. But there is one element that was designed by Rubens, and that's the so-called Pantheon. It was Rubens's sculpture museum. It was here that he displayed his fabulous collection of antique or ancient marbles, antiquities. But the architectural novelty is the fact that it was domed and lit by an oculus, so a round hole in top of the roof. And there's one antiquity that I would like to point out here, and that is, of course, the bust in the center, a bust that we now call the Pseudo Seneca. Everybody thought, certainly Rubens thought, that that man represented the Stoic philosopher Seneca. And in Rubens's life, and in the life of many of Rubens's friends, Seneca and Stoic philosophy was a kind of beacon, something that they would live with those particular thoughts, peace of mind. You have to be balanced. You have to keep your emotions under control. Use your brain, use your reason. Recently, it has been suggested by one of my colleagues, Professor Koen Jonkheere, that these particular emperor portraits, and there must have been 12, probably, were painted by Rubens to decorate his own house. And more in particular, they probably hung in the Sculpture Museum, in the Pantheon. As you can see, when you zoom in, they are very sketchily painted, very loosely painted. So they don't have a finished character. And that was or is an extra argument to assume that they were in fact painted for private use in the house. So here we are in the other part of the house, and here we have one of Rubens's self-portraits, and there aren't many. Now, Rubens was a great portrait painter, but he did not like portraiture. In the 16th century and the 17th century, portraiture was considered as a lower genre. It was not an important genre. Everybody could paint portraits because making a portrait is just painting what you see. For Rubens, that was not exciting enough. It didn't require much invention. And what is remarkable in the case of Rubens is that he painted a number, not a lot, of self-portraits. And this is one of them. It is usually dated around 1630, maybe a bit earlier. And as we can see, it's a bust portrait. And again, it is highly unfinished. Only the face is fully finished. All the rest is very sketchily painted, and that suggests to us that it was made for his own use. By which I mean that it was probably displayed in the house, but it was also used as a model for group portraits of Rubens in the company of other people. And we know certainly 2 or 3 examples in which this particular pose of Rubens appears. And this portrait has only recently been restored. It is, of course, almost the icon of the Rubens house and of the city of Antwerp. During restoration, almost 8, could have been more, layers of overpaint were removed, as well as a number of layers of yellowed varnish. And now we are, well, very close to the way that the portrait looked like in the 17th century. We are almost underneath Rubens's skin. This particular picture was painted by a German artist, Wilhelm Schubert von Ehrenberg. And this one is a very, well, unique example within his oeuvre because it shows the interior of the Jesuit church in Antwerp. And one of the remarkable items was the fact that it was entirely decorated in marble. What makes this painting so special is the fact that it is also painted on marble. So it's a picture not painted on canvas, not painted on panel, but painted on stone. That's why it needs special support. It's incredibly heavy. It is, of course, also an important church in many, many other ways. Rubens, for example, was closely involved in the decoration of the church, the pictorial decoration, and also the sculpture decoration. The final room for this film is more or less the apotheosis, the studio. This must have been a bustling room. You would have had people preparing panels, boys preparing paints, pigments, assistants working on pictures, different pictures at the same time. And Rubens kind of in the middle like a stage director, giving orders, correcting where necessary, putting final touches, etc., etc. So not a quiet room, but almost a kind of small factory. And no better picture to start with than this small portrait, which carries a particular story. It's a portrait of the young Anthony van Dyck. And Van Dyck was, of course, we all know that, Van Dyck was Rubens's most important assistant. He wasn't necessarily a pupil of Rubens, although he learned a lot from the master. And it was only later in his teens that he was recruited by Rubens to come and work in the Rubens workshop. And we assume that this portrait was more or less painted around the time that Anthony van Dyck arrived in Rubens's workshop. We believe it is not painted by Rubens, but painted by Van Dyck himself. So in fact, we are almost certainly looking at a self-portrait by Van Dyck. So one theory, one hypothesis may be that the young Van Dyck entered Rubens's workshop and he painted a self-portrait for Rubens in the style of the master, more or less to suggest, I can paint like you. And what we see here is a boy, a young man, an adolescent of 16, 17 years, very self-assured, looking at himself in the mirror and, well, about to embark on a magnificent career. This is one of the star pieces of the museum, and certainly one of my personal favorites. Well, it's a battle scene, as you can see, and it depicts an episode from the life of Henry IV, the French king, the husband of Maria de Medici. And in fact, the picture was commissioned by Maria de Medici to celebrate the life of her deceased husband. But the picture was left unfinished. And the reason is very simple. At a certain moment in history, Maria de Medici lost power. And the commission, the important commission, was abandoned altogether. And this picture was in his workshop when Maria de Medici was out. And so he just left the commission. And in fact, you could also say that we're looking at a large modello, because you actually see the painter at work. Here we see Rubens working directly on the canvas. You see his brush strokes. You almost hear him think. You almost hear him breathe while working on this picture. It's almost like an action painting. It's not just an action scene. When we look closely, when you zoom in, you can see that it is painted by two hands. And also that the top layer of that picture is finished, contrary to the main scene below. And the top was painted by someone called Peter Snijders, a painter from Brussels, who specialized in landscapes and in battle scenes, so-called bataljes. That was his forte, and it was used by Rubens to fill in the upper half of that picture. Apart from the fact that I personally find it very exciting, it also tells us a lot about the way Rubens set up a composition. You can also see him taking risks, because some of those poses, and that is pretty, we find it in many, many Rubens pictures. The variety in poses, difficult poses. Well, that is what we see here. It is so utterly and truly Rubens. With this picture, we kind of go back in time. We enter the period of the early Rubens, it is generally assumed that this is one of the few pictures, one of the few remaining pictures painted by Rubens before he went to Italy. And it shows Adam and Eve in paradise, composition based on a print by Marcantonio Raimondi, the famous engraver who worked together with Raphael. Not every Rubens scholar accepts that it is in fact by Rubens. It has been suggested that it is in fact by Otto van Veen, Rubens' last teachers. We don't know. So Rubens scholarship remains undecided. It could be Van Veen, but it could also be Rubens, and there's a very strong case to be made for Rubens. In my view, this is too good to be by Van Veen, but what we are intending to do is to have this picture closely examined, technically examined, so material technical analysis might reveal who actually painted this picture. The final painting that I would like to show to the viewers is not by Rubens, but by Van Dyck. It is in fact the Apostle Matthew. At the time, Van Dyck would have been, say, 18 or 19 years of age. It is an apostle, but at the same time, this picture can also be considered as a head study. So, a study of a remarkable, in this case, beautiful head. A head that would have been used, and that was in fact used, as a kind of, background figure, supporting actor, if you like, in a larger picture. That kind of practice of making head studies of remarkable heads. That was, of course, a practice that Rubens had taken from Italy, and we see this particular man appearing in a handful of early Van Dyck pictures in the background. It is painted in a different style than Van Dyck's self-portrait, the portrait that we talked about earlier on in the film. It's very loosely painted. It shows a self-confidence that is unmatched for a boy of 18, 19. And you see how he kind of applies this wet, the wet paint in one, blow almost, to suggest a white shirt underneath the cloak of the young man. The confidence of this picture is remarkable, and it is really one of those pictures that, in its basic composition, it is very simple. There's not a lot of excitement with regard to the color scheme. It's almost monochromatic, but the power and the force of this painting is just wonderful. And also the way, the material aspect of this picture, the way that Van Dyck applies paint is, well, I can look at this painting for hours. Well, I sincerely hope that you've enjoyed this little tour. There's much more to see in the Rubens House Museum, but I hope that this gave you an incentive and a reason to come to the museum when we reopen, and I do hope from the bottom of my heart that we will reopen very soon. And in the meantime, I can only say thank you again and stay safe.